The room was still, almost sacred in its silence, as though time itself had paused to listen. The faint rhythm of the heart monitor echoed softly in the background, steady yet fragile, a quiet reminder that every beat was borrowed time. I sat beside him, my fingers wrapped around his, feeling the warmth slipping away little by little. The light in his eyes was dimming, but there was still a flicker, a spark of something unfinished, something that needed to be said before it was too late. He looked at me, not with the authority of a father, but with the tenderness of a man who had finally understood what life truly meant. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, his breath shallow, words fighting their way through the weight of years and regrets. Then came the whisper, almost like a breeze brushing against my ear, "Don't repeat my mistake." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. His voice was weak, but the look in his eyes carried a depth that words could never hold. There was pain, sorrow, and something else, a plea. I could feel my heart tightening in my chest, trying to hold back tears that wanted to escape. My mind began to race. What mistake? What was he trying to protect me from? I wanted to ask, to make him explain. But his eyes told me everything I needed to know. They were filled with the weight of a man who had lived too long with something unsaid, something unhealed. The whisper wasn't just a message, it was a confession. I remember staring at him, trying to memorize every line of his face, every wrinkle that held a story, every breath that grew shallower by the minute. There was a heaviness in the room that I couldn't describe, not fear, not grief, but the realization that this was the last time I would hear his voice. My thoughts became a blur, fragments of memories flashing through my mind, his laughter, his silence, the way he used to hide his exhaustion behind a forced smile. Everything suddenly made sense in a way it never had before. I realized that this whisper wasn't random. It was rehearsed in his heart for years, waiting for this exact moment to escape. He tightened his grip on my hand, as if to make sure I truly heard him. His eyes searched mine, desperate to be understood. It wasn't just a father giving advice to a child. It was a soul trying to pass on its final truth before it faded away. And I knew deep down that those 4 words carried the weight of an entire lifetime. I wanted to tell him I understood, that I wouldn't make the same mistake, but my throat locked up. The only sound I could manage was the quiet sob that slipped through my lips. The air grew colder. The machines kept their steady rhythm, but I could feel his energy slipping like sand through my fingers. I leaned closer, hoping he'd say more, hoping he'd give me something to hold on to, a clue, a reason, anything that would explain the mystery behind his words. But his lips barely moved after that. He just looked at me with those fading eyes, filled with so much love and sorrow that it felt like the world had stopped breathing. In that single whisper, he gave me the most powerful message of his life, one that would echo in my mind long after the room grew silent, long after his hand went still in mine. In the days that followed, his words stayed with me like an echo I couldn't escape. "Don't repeat my mistake." I heard them in the quiet of the morning, when the world was still half asleep, in the sound of the wind brushing against the window, in the way the night air felt heavy when I lay awake thinking of him. At first, I searched for something dramatic, something specific, maybe a wrong decision, a lost opportunity, a broken promise. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize that his regret wasn't about something tangible. It was deeper than that, buried beneath layers of pride, fear, and the weight of unspoken emotions. As I looked back over the years, pieces of his life started fitting together like fragments of a puzzle I had ignored for too long. My father was a man of discipline, of responsibility, of relentless effort. He worked tirelessly, always chasing something: stability, respect, success, maybe even redemption. But in that pursuit, he became distant. He was always present in body, but rarely in spirit. Our conversations were short, practical, wrapped in formality. How's school? Did you eat? Be careful out there. Words that cared but never reached the heart. There was love, yes, but it was quiet, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered by someone brave enough to look for it. He was the kind of man who believed that emotions were a weakness, that showing affection made you vulnerable, that success was the proof of love. He built a life that looked strong on the outside but lonely on the inside. I remember birthdays where his chair at the table sat empty because he was working late. I remember moments when I needed his comfort, but he'd respond with advice instead of warmth. I used to think he didn't understand, that he didn't care enough to try. But now, looking back, I see that he cared too much. He just didn't know how to show it. His mistake wasn't neglect in the traditional sense. It was emotional silence. I started noticing the signs of his regret in the smallest details. The way he'd linger in the doorway when leaving for work, as if wanting to say something but stopping himself. The way he'd smile at family laughter but never join in. The way his eyes softened whenever he thought no one was looking. It was as though he was haunted by all the words he never said, all the moments he let slip away in the name of responsibility. He gave everything to give us a good life, yet he never realized that the best part of life isn't what you build, but who you build it with. I thought about how often we, too, make the same mistake, believing that love can wait, that family will understand, that there's always more time. We bury ourselves in work, in routine, in survival, convincing ourselves it's for the ones we love, not realizing that in doing so, we're slowly drifting away from them. My father's life was full of accomplishments, but his heart carried a quiet ache, the ache of moments missed, conversations left unfinished, hugs never given. The truth behind his whisper wasn't about failure or loss in the world's eyes. It was about missing the true essence of living. He had spent a lifetime providing for others, but had forgotten to connect with them. He had mastered the art of endurance, but never the practice of expression. And in his final days, when the noise of life had faded and only truth remained, he saw clearly what years of pride had hidden. His whisper was not a warning born from fear. It was a plea born from understanding, a hope that I would live differently, love differently, and never wait for the right moment to show what's in my heart. It took me a long time to face what his words truly meant. At first, I tried to move on, telling myself that life had to continue, that grief should be kept tidy and quiet. But no matter how busy I became, that whisper followed me. It showed up in moments I didn't expect. During dinners where everyone was laughing, but something felt missing. During quiet drives home when the silence felt heavier than usual. During those nights when the glow of my phone was the only light in the room, and I realized I hadn't truly spoken to anyone all day. It was then I started to see the same pattern that had haunted my father's life slowly taking shape in mine. I noticed how easy it was to mistake connection for communication. I was surrounded by people, yet I felt detached. I said the right words, but they carried no depth. I listened, but rarely with my heart. I began to see that my father's mistake wasn't a single choice. It was a habit, a way of living that quietly built walls between hearts while convincing you that everything was fine. He had taught me how to be strong, how to endure, how to survive, but he never showed me how to be open, how to be vulnerable, how to say, I need you, without feeling weak. As I looked around my family, I saw reflections of the same silence he had carried. We loved each other, yes, but we didn't always say it. We cared deeply, but we didn't always show it. But we apologized with gestures instead of words, forgave without ever discussing what hurt us, and avoided difficult conversations because we feared they might break the fragile peace we were used to. I could feel the distance growing between us, a quiet emptiness, that lingered even when we were in the same room. It wasn't anger that kept us apart. It was pride, that quiet, stubborn pride that whispers, they should come to me first, or they already know how I feel. But the truth is, love left unspoken starts to fade, not because it disappears, but because it gets buried under assumptions, routines, and years of pretending everything's okay. My father's regret began to unfold before my eyes through the smallest gestures. The way my mother stared at his chair after he was gone, the way my siblings avoided talking about him because it was too painful, the way we all tiptoed around our emotions, afraid to stir the grief that was already there. I began to understand that his silence hadn't only hurt him, it had shaped all of us. I started remembering moments from childhood that suddenly made sense. The time he wanted to join us at the park, but stayed behind to finish a phone call. The times I wanted to tell him how much I admired him, but stopped, afraid he might dismiss it. The years we spent living in the same house, but in separate worlds of unspoken thoughts and missed tenderness. His life had been a collection of moments where love was felt but not shared, where care was shown but never spoken, where the need for connection was always postponed for later. And now, standing where he once stood, I could feel how easy it was to repeat that pattern without even realizing it. I could feel myself working longer hours, avoiding emotional talks, convincing myself that showing strength meant hiding softness. It was his story replaying through me, and that realization shook me deeply. His whisper wasn't just about what he had done, it was about what we were all still doing. Choosing distance over honesty, silence over vulnerability, pride over peace. And I knew that if I didn't learn from his mistake, I would one day whisper the same words to someone I loved, too late for them to change anything at all. The shift didn't happen overnight. It began quietly, almost unnoticed, like a gentle tug at the edges of my heart, reminding me that something had to change. For so long, I had lived behind a calm face, a steady tone, and a composed posture, just like my father. I thought keeping emotions tucked away made me strong. That silence was dignity, and that not needing anyone was independence. But somewhere between his final whisper and the emptiness that followed, I started to see the truth, that strength without softness becomes isolation, and silence, when carried too long, turns into sorrow. I began to realize that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was courage in its purest form. I remember the first time I tried to break that old habit. It was awkward, unfamiliar, almost painful. I picked up the phone to call my mother, not for any reason, just to ask how she was doing. She paused for a moment, surprised, as if waiting for a purpose behind the call. When I said I just wanted to hear her voice, the silence that followed spoke louder than words. It was the sound of something soft cracking open, the sound of connection returning to a place that had long forgotten it. From then on, I started doing the things my father never had the chance to do. I said, "I love you," out loud even when it felt uncomfortable. I apologized when I was wrong instead of waiting for time to blur the hurt. I started to listen with my heart instead of my judgment. There were moments when my voice trembled, when I felt exposed, when the old version of me whispered, "This isn't how you were raised." But I kept going. Every time I reached out, every time I allowed myself to feel, I felt closer to the kind of life he wanted for me, one that wasn't guarded by pride, but guided by connection. I began to notice how much healing comes when you stop pretending that everything is fine. Conversations that once felt impossible started happening. Apologies found their way between family members who hadn't spoken openly in years. Even small gestures, a touch on the shoulder, a handwritten note, a message sent late at night, carried more weight than any grand act of success. The more I embraced vulnerability, the more I understood what my father had missed. He had spent his life holding everything together. The family, the finances, the image of a man who never broke, but in doing so, he never gave himself permission to be human. I could see now that he had loved deeply, but feared that love might make him lose control. I didn't want that fear to define me anymore. I didn't want to be remembered as someone who was always strong, but never open. So I started to let people in. Slowly, life began to change in the smallest but most beautiful ways. My relationships grew softer, warmer, more honest. People started sharing things with me that they had never shared before, as if my openness gave them permission to open too. I noticed how laughter felt deeper when it was shared without pretension, how forgiveness felt lighter when spoken aloud, how love became easier when you stopped trying to earn it. It wasn't about becoming perfect or getting everything right. It was about being real, being present, being unafraid to feel. In those quiet, reflective moments, I often thought about him, about what it might have been like if he had given himself the same permission. I pictured him laughing without restraint, hugging without hesitation, speaking his heart without fear of judgment. That image stayed with me, not as a memory, but as a guide, a reminder of what it means to live fully and love freely, of what it takes to break the silence that generations before us have mistaken for strength. I began to understand that my father's final words were not meant to haunt me, but to free me. They were a reminder that life is fragile, that love is fleeting, and that time has a way of running out when we least expect it. His mistake wasn't that he didn't love enough. It was that he waited too long to show it. And that realization became the quiet turning point in how I viewed everything. I started to see the people around me differently. I looked at their faces, their eyes, their wariness, their laughter, and I thought about how temporary all of it was. We live like there's always another chance, another tomorrow, another season to fix what's broken. But sometimes tomorrow doesn't come. Sometimes the conversation you keep postponing becomes the one you never have. I started telling people what I felt, not in dramatic ways, but in the small, honest moments that mattered. I told my friends I was grateful for them. I told my family that I missed them even when we hadn't fought. I hugged longer, listened deeper, forgave quicker. I realized that love wasn't supposed to be earned or proven. It was meant to be lived out loud in words, in actions, in presence. My father had spent a lifetime believing that his love was understood without being spoken. But love unspoken sometimes feels invisible. I didn't want the people I cared about to ever have to wonder. There were moments when I stumbled, when pride still rose up in me, whispering that I didn't need to be the first to reach out. But every time I felt that hesitation, I remembered his whisper. I remembered the way his eyes looked that night, full of things he wished he had said. That memory had a way of silencing my ego and softening my heart. I learned that sometimes strength isn't in holding your ground, it's in reaching across it. Sometimes healing doesn't come from being right, it comes from being kind. As I grew into this new way of living, I began to see that my father's story wasn't just about him. It was about all of us, all the people walking through life carrying unsaid apologies, unfinished conversations, unexpressed love. We're taught to work hard, to aim high, to be successful, but rarely are we taught how to stay emotionally present. We build careers, houses, reputations, but we forget to build understanding. We forget that at the end of every chase, every accomplishment, what we crave most isn't applause, but connection. I think that's what my father discovered too late. That life's meaning doesn't come from what you achieve, but from who you hold close while you're achieving it. I began to see how different life feels when you choose connection over perfection. When you tell someone you love them even in the middle of an argument. When you apologize first, even if you weren't the only one at fault. When you show up without waiting to be asked. It changes you. It softens you. It fills you in ways that success never could. I watched the people around me respond differently too. Barriers began to fall, hearts began to open, and moments began to matter again. Every time I share this story, I feel like I'm keeping his voice alive, like his mistake isn't just a lesson from the past, but a guide for the present. Because the truth is, we don't need to wait for loss to learn what really matters. We don't need to reach the edge of life to realize that love and presence are the only things that last. His whisper was a warning, yes, but it was also a blessing, a reminder to speak, to feel, to forgive, and to live before the moment slips quietly out of reach.